Appreciate it. Okay, let's get started, folks. Welcome, everyone, to the McAllister House Museum Speaker Series. We've got a nice talk this evening, and I'm looking forward to jumping into it, but I just want to greet everybody. I want to say happy spring to everyone. I don't have too much to share as far as upcoming events. We will be having another talk in the summer, and that's going to be open house style here at the McAllister House. We haven't set a date for that yet, but as soon as we do, we'll get that out to all you folks. There is one date that I would like for everybody to put on their calendars, and that is the last Saturday in September is going to be our second annual Harvest Festival. The first annual Harvest Festival was extremely popular and we did very well, and we're looking forward to it again. We do have an announcement regarding that, and that is that our local jazz aficionado, Wayne Wilkerson, will be playing at our Harvest Fest on that Saturday. And so we're very much looking forward to having his talent here for a fun afternoon at the McAllister House on Saturday, the 24th, the last Saturday in September. With that, I would like to go ahead and get started with the presentation that we have tonight. The title for this presentation is, I also am not seeing my buttons. Hold on one second, there we go. The development of Fountain Colony and Henry McAllister's role. For those of you that don't know, my name is Eric Metzger. I'm the executive director of the McAllister House Museum. For some time now, folks, we have been talking about two fundamental issues here at the McAllister House. And the first one is going to be addressed with this talk today. And that is, what did Henry McAllister do? What was his role here? How did he influence the culture here in Colorado Springs? Of course, being the museum that is his house, we're very interested in that, what he and his family did and how they changed or altered culture here in Colorado Springs and in Colorado. We'll be talking about that tonight. Another strain of thought that we've been working on for a long time, as many of you know and have seen the talks, is our interpretation of the house, of the McAllister House, the architecture, the grounds, the horticulture, the apple orchards, the experimental garden that was on the grounds. We will touch on that in this conversation, but this is very much about Henry McAllister's role. So in that light, let's go ahead and get started. To begin with, I want to define a term. I don't know if anybody in this group is really interested in the colonization issue, but basically I would like to define colony and colonization for us before we get started. In contemporary sociology, anthropology, colony is a touchy term. And it is often defined as number one there, the subjugation of a people or area, especially as an extension of state power. I would like for us to assume that that is a good definition of a colony or colonization, but we're going to be using a definition that's a little bit different than that, and that's the latter. So a colony as an association of individuals that banded together for the purpose of migrating west in order to pursue common aims once they arrived at their destination. Colonization is a tough issue today, folks. The term is loaded with a number of different concepts and extrapolations. We want to be careful when we talk about colonization and certain issues that are touchy. I would like for us to just use this second definition so that we can talk about this issue of the colonization of Eastern Colorado. That is the terms that they used when they did it, when the actions occurred, and historians for some time used those terms also, and that's what we'll be using today. So let's go ahead and jump in. So what we're going to talk about first, folks, is history writ large, and how then we will narrow it down to how Colorado participated in that larger history. And so nationally, it doesn't get much more interesting and significant than the Homestead Act of 1862. So we're going to just touch on a little history here for a moment. The Homestead Act of 1862 opened up millions of acres in the West. We can see on this image here in the red, that is all land that was available via the Homestead Act. Lincoln signed this act act soon after he got into office, but he waited until the southern states seceded until he signed this legislation. So this is a very important piece of national legislation. Obviously, for us in the state of Colorado, if we just look at that map, and it's why I'm using it, we can understand how important that act might be for the state of Colorado and its development. Notice that the government is not trying to give land in the mountains. That is all out there in the plains. Notice also something about that map, and that is the two major river valleys have already been privatized. They are either still in the hands of the government or they're owned by private individuals, and that is along the South Platte and the Arkansas River. Those are those two gaps that we can see in that red on the right. Interesting to note that women and immigrants who had applied for citizenship were eligible for their own homesteading. And something else that's interesting, that's important for our conversation, is that the leading proponents were Andrew Johnson and a man named Horace Greeley, who owned a small newspaper in New York City. I'm kidding when I say a small newspaper. The next piece of history that we're very interested in chronologically is May of 1869 in northern Utah, and that is the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad. We don't really need to go into the importance of that. I think everybody understands it, but it's very important for our talk tonight and that date. Remember 1869. And then, of course, a very, very important date for us here in Colorado Springs, and we just passed it coming up on a year ago, and that is July 31st, 1871. Look at that picture, folks. What a great picture. And it looks so neat with this lonely wagon kind of going down the road. That's one of my favorites. July 31st, 1871. We just celebrated our 150th anniversary here in Colorado Springs. So those are the three important dates that I would like for people to think about. 1862, Homestead Act, settling of the West. It's interrupted a little bit because of the Civil War, but then it picks up in the 1870s, and that's the time period that we'll be talking about. And then with the railroad coming in, actually comes through Cheyenne in 1868. And so the railroad begins south as early as 1868. Okay, now we're going to back up just a moment and we're going to talk about the railroad era. So I set up the dates and the time period for the railroad and for the colonization that follows it, but let's take a close look at the railroad era in Colorado beginning in fall 1869. This is a fantastic map. Take a close look at this, folks, if you're able to. We have a Denver Pacific Railway map here, and the star at the top is Cheyenne, the middle one is Evans, and the lower one is Denver. But what makes this map so interesting is, number one, the date. So it's an 1868 map, so relatively early as far as the railroads go. And what it is it's planning out routes that the railroad might take, and it is also identifying resources that those railroads might go to so that we can extract those resources. If you look over here on the left, over here we have the term gold, we have silver. Where my cursor is right now, that's Nederland, Colorado area. And so they're aware of some mining possibilities up there. We see coal fields here north of Denver in the Boulder, Longmont area. We see copper here. And of course, we see timber in the foothills. So what the Denver Pacific Railway has done is that they have scouted out all these areas and they've located potential mining areas and where railroad routes might go to in order to extract those resources. This map is fantastic for understanding Colorado and the era, and it's why I chose it, and it helps us to understand the railroad coming south. So in 1869, the leg from Cheyenne to Evans was completed, and then in June of 1870, that second leg, the railroad rolls into Union Station. And what this map is really helping us with, and the concept that I'd like for us to think about in this and the next slide, is that it's helping us to understand the relationship between railroad and mining. Yes, we could extract those things out of the mountains with wagons and horse and mule, but it would be quite difficult. Railroad is really going to change mining and the extraction of resources in Colorado. So this one's a little bit more pertinent for us in Colorado Springs. We can see on this map the dotted line from Denver to Colorado Springs in between the two stars. The dotted line indicates that it is a hypothetical route. It has not been built yet. There's another one going up over to Fairplay to the left there. Can you see that? And we can see the words heavy timber there along the ridge. And also down here, we can see timber. This is the Black Forest down here. So we've got the divide basically. And again, the relationship between the railroads and mining that will be occurring in the future. This is the area where Palmer in 1869 and 1870 begins to buy land south all the way to Colorado City. I said Colorado Springs, but I have to say that that's a mistake. What is denoted at that red star at the bottom is Colorado City. That was the city that was in existence, or town that was in existence. Colorado Springs was not in existence yet. All during this time that Palmer is buying up land down to Colorado City and around that area, McAllister is working for him in Philadelphia, looking for investors and selling land. So this somewhat convoluted map, folks, is also very interesting, but for a slightly different purpose. What this is basically the plan that General Palmer submitted to the federal government of the railways that he wanted to gain access to. Just a quick quick note on terms. Railway denotes an access way. Railroad denotes that that road has been built. So when we say, and look at the map here and look at the Mountain Base Railway, the South Park Railway, and the Western Colorado Railway, what we're referring to there is the possibility that routes would be built to those destinations. This is part of Palmer's grand plan. We've got the 3 red stars on the right, which is Denver, to be Colorado Springs, and to be Pueblo. And then we've got the territory in the state of Colorado that is where Palmer wants to exploit the resources. This, folks, is why he builds a narrow gauge railroad and not a standard gauge, because his plan is to extract these resources from the mountains. And it's going to be a lot better in the mountains, cheaper, easier if we build it with narrow gauge. On the bottom left here, take a look at the things that he's planning to extract, including timber, iron, very importantly, coal, folks. It's very important for everybody to realize that somebody like Palmer basically is more interested in coal than he is in silver or gold. Now, obviously, he's probably interested in silver and gold too. But coal is very important. So are things like lime and water power. So the cities can be run that he's going to build, that these railroad tracks go through. So really, really neat map there too, showing us the plans of General Palmer, time period 1869. So in 1870, the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad is incorporated in October of that year. In October of the following year, it reaches the Fountain Colony. Phase 1 of his railroad, of which to Pueblo is phase 1, was built without federal financial aid, which is very significant. All major railroads to that point in the United States had had some financial aid from the federal government. So it's pretty unique. It turns out that when you do the research, Palmer was relatively pleased by the fact that he was not getting federal funding, because any of us that have worked for state or federal governments know there's a lot of paperwork and a lot of oversight to federal projects that Palmer really didn't want. So in the long run, it turned out to be pretty good that he did not have federal financial aid, and he was pleased because he was able to make smaller maneuvers that he wanted to make with his railroad. quickly, an impact of the railroad going through these towns in 1870 to 1872, just to give you folks a feel for the impact that a railroad is going to have, right? And then these numbers get extrapolated out, sometimes rather quickly, but you get an immediate impact when the railroad comes through your city or town. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about the colonization era of Eastern Colorado. So we're talking about the foothills, and the area along the foothills is where those resources are going to be available to be exploited. So we're not talking about far Eastern Colorado. We're talking about central and eastern plains where it meets the foothills. And again, what we're talking about is organized groups that immigrate to Colorado at the beginning of the railroad era. The first one that we'll talk about, and these are in chronological order. I hope that this is interesting to you folks. I went to school here in Colorado, and I never learned about these colonies. So to me, this is very interesting. And some of them failed. And this is an example of one that was not successful. The first one, the Chicago or German colony in early 1870, went out to the Wet Mountain Valley. They had purchased 40,000 acres, so they had a large colony going. This is where Colfax was, 15 miles west of Westcliff. Your buy-in into this colony would be $250 to give people a little feel for what we're talking about financially. And that would get you everything that you needed as far as land and irrigation. What these folks really, the mistake that they made was they didn't understand the short growing season up there in the Wet Mountain Valley. Lovely place, beautiful, and it gets warm in the summer. It's just a very short growing season, and that colony quickly collapsed. Some of the people remained in that area. You can still see some of the German people in that area, and but the colony did collapse. The other reason for that was problematic was that they didn't have railroad access early on there. The Union colony is probably the most significant, and that's Greeley in 1870. Nathan Meeker, an agricultural editor of the New York Tribune, and Horace Greeley are the founders of that colony. Obviously, it's an agriculturally based colony, and we can get a feel of that from this great image. This is a fantastic image because it shows us a lot about how the colony was formed. What you got when you bought into the Union colony was that you got a plot of land in town, and that's what we're looking at in this picture. And then on the bottom, you can see the irrigation. You also got irrigation to your town lot. You also got a plot of land outside of town for agriculture, and you got irrigation to that. So that's what you got when you bought into the Union colony. And you can see that due to that structure, it looks very neat and organized. We'll contrast that with Fountain Colony picture that I'll show you a little bit later that doesn't look quite the same, doesn't look quite as bucolic. It was a large colony, 72,000 acres, and it is the first prohibition town in the state of Colorado, and Fountain Colony follows that nod and becomes a prohibition town also. The Chicago or Colorado colony is Boulder or Longmont area. It basically became Longmont. Take a look at that picture, folks. I think it's pretty funny. Each one of these colonies really chose a mountain that would be their mountain. And Longmont's is Long's Peak there. So they feel like that's their mountain. And of course, we feel like we've got our own little mountain down here too in Colorado Springs. Agricultural orientation, confluence of St. Vrain Creek and Left Hand Creek. A couple others that really didn't last long for different reasons. The St. Louis Western is in Evans, Colorado, and that's just south of Greeley, and it got absorbed by Greeley. So it did have success, but it wasn't going to be a competitor to Greeley. It got absorbed. And then the Southwestern colony out of Memphis, Tennessee, strangely enough, Green City was east of Greeley, and it didn't do very well. And after 2 years, it basically folded. The Fountain Colony of Colorado 1871. We'll talk more about this in just a moment, obviously. Initially promoted as a resort destination, many of you know. The economy here would be oriented to general commerce and the distribution of natural resources. Palmer's plan, right? Driven primarily by the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. The economy benefited from agriculturalists that were already in the area. They were south of town, people such as Robert Armstrong, and they really assisted McAllister in understanding the potential for agriculture here on the high plains of Colorado Springs or the Fountain Colony, and McAllister would pick up on that, and he would use that as leverage in the economy a few years later. Two more, and then we're done talking about the colonization era, folks. But South Pueblo was a part of Palmer's plan and the Central Colorado Improvement Company that he owned, and that was going to be the industrial center for his enterprise. And Fountain Colony was going to be the commerce and distribution center. Also, Fort Collins forms in 72. General Robert Cameron becomes the president, and it is also agriculturally oriented. Excuse me. So now we're going to take a closer look at Fountain Colony. We've looked at the railroad and the railroad coming through Colorado, and then the colonization that occurs as the railroad comes through. Those things occur with timing, and they need to be very well timed. We'll talk about that just a moment with Fountain Colony and its timing. But we're going to take a closer look now at the Fountain Colony and its development through the mechanism of the Colorado Springs Company. So Palmer organizes what he calls the Colorado Springs Company in October of 1870. He's the president, and when he initially creates it, he doesn't fill the officers' positions very quickly. Initially, the only person that is employed by this company is Maurice Kingsley as the assistant secretary. It's great to read about Maurice here in Colorado Springs. What he does is he opens the mail. He's in charge of opening the mail. People all over the world, not the eastern part of the world, but the western world, are mailing Colorado Springs or Fountain Colony to try to understand what sort of development is happening here and at what pace. They are interested in possibly investing in the Fountain Colony, and they are emailing to find out what is going on. So this gentleman, Maurice Kingsley, who is British, he is here basically temporarily. He leaves a little bit later, but he is working for the Colorado Springs Company. McAllister is eventually elected executive director, but there is a gap in time before McAllister comes into play in the Colorado Springs Company. Here's the important part of the whole talk, folks, is that the Fountain Colony itself, the structure, the development of the colony, is subordinate to the Colorado Springs Company. Palmer sets it up that way very intentionally so that when he does find an executive director of the Colorado Springs Company, that individual then is by de facto the boss of the Fountain Colony and can make the decisions that need to be made. So we're in this nebulous time period of 1871-72, and McAllister has not been named as the executive director yet, but he will soon. Just a reminder of the date, Colorado Springs established in July 31 of 1871. Approximately 50 people come mostly from the Greeley colony. A number of them become officers of the Colorado Springs Company, and they come down and settle on this famous day, July 31st, 1871, when the first stake is driven. The funny part of this picture is if you turn the camera 180 degrees, you would see a contingent of maybe around 100 people kind of cheering this on, the fact that the first stake is being driven. So you see the planes here looking at the back. In the photograph, you can't see Pikes Peak really, but it's behind them, and the town has already started. There are some buildings up and about 50 people living in the area at the time. So as I mentioned, some of these people from Greeley became officers of the Colorado Springs Company. The significant ones are Cameron. He became the manager of the Colorado Springs, of the Fountain Colony. Paber is the secretary, and Nettleton is an engineer. He platted the streets, and he starts construction on El Paso Canal, which is so significant. That's why I mentioned that and emphasized that with the agriculturally based colonies, is that you bought into the colony and you got irrigation. It also was true in Fountain Colony. By buying into a plot and building a home, you were going to get irrigation eventually. It starts coming in August 4th, 1871, and pretty soon the town can get irrigation. And that allows us to plant those cottonwoods, right? Those famous cottonwoods from Arkansas River Valley. So McAllister arrives in Colorado Springs on April 10th of 1872, and at that time it seems that he has not accepted the position of executive director of the Colorado Springs Company yet. He may be in negotiations with Palmer. We do not know the exact date at which he accepts that position, but I would like to emphasize that when he steps foot in Colorado Springs there on April 10th in 1872, he already holds a number of positions that relate to the colony. He is a director of the Union Contract Company that builds the Denver and Rio Grande line from Denver to Pueblo. He is a board member of that railroad. He is secretary of the National Land and Improvement Company, and he still holds his position in Philadelphia as secretary of the American Association of Iron and Steel in Philadelphia. Down at the bottom here, I've got this note, and what I'm referring to there is, look back up at the top. When McAllister arrives April 10th, 1872, his second-born son just arrived about a month before that. Now, something important to remember about the McAllisters, they lost their firstborn son after 2 days in Philadelphia. And so this Harry McAllister being born was very, very special to them, and they would have been taking precautions as to his health. And that may come into one of the reasons why they moved to Colorado Springs. But what I'm suggesting on this slide is that McAllister's not reticence, but his delay in accepting the position as executive director may be because he is starting a family in Philadelphia, and he just had his first son. They'll be working on their second child in just a little bit, and he really wants for that son to be a little bit older before they travel across country. This is about health and safety of his family, of which was of utmost importance to Henry McAllister. So McAllister goes back to see his son and wife, and then he takes the job, and he returns October 1st in 1872 to take control of Fountain Colony. Here are some of the quotations from the Gazette and some of the information that gives us a sense of how significant the filling of this position is, and of Major McAllister arriving in person at the Fountain Colony to take charge. It seems that reading these articles in the Gazette, like there was a void, that the colony could feel that there was no leader. Palmer really had his eye on other projects and enterprises, so he was really not going to be the individual that would live in town and be the visual and vocal leader. It seems there was a paucity of leadership here at the Fountain Colony. Now, those of us that know Palmer, it's hard for us to believe that that was part of his plan. And that's what leads me to believe that he was trying to get Henry McAllister to accept that job, and that they were in negotiations. So in October, finally, Henry accepts that position. And through the Gazette and the Out West, we can see that the local population was very happy to have their leader in place. And we will see that in the Gazette articles coming up here in just a moment. So now we're starting to drill down on what McAllister's role was. And on the right here, we've got the definition of what the Colorado Springs Company was supposed to do in its oversight of Fountain Colony. So as we drill down, we see that the business plan by Palmer for the Colorado Springs Company was that they made some calculations about the initial 2,000 acres that were up here sitting on the base of the, up at the top of the plateau where the colony existed. Now this is just the initial town site. The town site would grow to be 9,000 to 10,000 acres, but the initial town site of 2,000 acres, they made calculations to try to understand how they would make their money as well as invest infrastructure into the Fountain Colony. And here's the formula that they came up with. They thought that eventually the land could be sold for a total of around $500,000. 150,000 of that would eventually go to Palmer's Railroad, the Denver and Rio Grande, as profit for the Denver and Rio Grande. 150,000 was earmarked to go to streets, ditches, trees, parks, schools, and other essential features. And 240,000 of that would pay for surveying, platting, irrigation wells, administration, and advertising. So they have specific goals for this executive director of Fountain Colony. These are the things that Henry McAllister accepted as his job description when he took the job, and these would be the things that he would immediately start to work on. Now, some of these are long-term projects. Some of them are things that could be done right away. That was up to McAllister to understand and figure out what sort of trajectory and specifically what he would focus on in the near future and in the further future. We have a certificate here, the National Land and Improvement Company. This is a certificate that we have here at the McAllister House Museum. McAllister needed to sign any of those certificates that were sold as secretary, and he was still selling land even though he had moved from Philadelphia out here to Colorado Springs. He still was responsible for selling the land, but he now had these other responsibilities that he was going to be focused on. So folks, I know that this is small font, but I wanted to create an impact, just as I say in the title of this slide. These are just some of the things that McAllister did here in the Fountain Colony, folks. What I'm trying to convey by showing you this slide is not just having this impact of so many different things, but I'd like to look at a couple of these things. What's pretty amazing as we look at this is the breadth of experience and interest at which Henry McAllister and Elizabeth Cooper McAllister bring to Fountain Colony. Ultimately, I think that his value and the value of bringing him and the McAllister family as executive director to the Fountain Colony, I think here is where it lies. We had this slide. I'm going to go back one and just remind people. We had these things that he had to do as part of his job. These were the requirements of his job, and I believe that he did those quite well. He had success with those. But I really think that the value that McAllister brings to this Fountain Colony project are the things that you're looking at here. And I'm going to highlight a couple of them. Everything is in the time period and location that we're talking about, except for the very top thing and the very last thing. The first thing, the Secretary, American Association of Iron and Steel, 1865 to 72. That's where he gained his experience. He took his experience from his wartime efforts and he took them to the association and did very well there. He's a detail-oriented type of individual, Henry McAllister is. And then look at all these things that he does. He's one of the original trustees of Colorado College. Even Palmer was not one of the original trustees. He was added a short time later because they realized that they needed his significance on the board of trustees. But Henry McAllister really got Colorado College settled here in Colorado Springs and was the primary driver for that. And then if we look at some of these things that are more cultural, down at the bottom, a delegate, the Republican National Convention in Cincinnati, the executive committee, the Colorado Women's Suffrage Association in 1877. And then of course, the last thing which takes place outside of the time period that we're referring to, but I wanted to remind people that he's one of the founding members of the El Paso County Pioneers Association, which still exists today. So we see these interesting things that are cultural, and some of these come from his Quaker background, his interest in education, his interest in civics, but Henry McAllister for the rest of his life participates in Fountain Colony and the city of Colorado Springs to a great extent, even after the point in which they are required by his position. So in 1879, he resigns his position and he does a number of other things for the city of Colorado Springs. Take a look too at this agriculture and industry in the middle here. These are important to us here at the McAllister House. He has an experimental garden here on the property. He's co-founder of the Industrial Association, and he has a lot of interest in agriculture and horticulture and fruit, the Pomological Society. He is the founder of those two societies here locally. So he did an awful lot, and he had a breadth to it that was very interesting. We'll kind of take a look at some of these things. Local concerns, certain levels of infrastructure, education, water, libraries, the college. Mr. Tenney had an interview with Major McAllister, and a satisfactory arrangement in regard to the donation of land is taken care of. Major McAllister was the primary individual from Fountain Colony that was responsible for getting Colorado College to come to Colorado Springs. The Congregationalists were shopping it between Greeley, Denver, and Colorado Springs, and it was McAllister's efforts that got the college to come and land in Colorado Springs. It definitely didn't hurt that both McAllister and Palmer donated quite a bit of money and land to that effort. That also helped to get it here. Interestingly, McAllister was the second largest contributor in the earliest years to the college. He gave $10,000 to Colorado College folks. The cost that we think the house here at on Cascade was, we think it was about a $5,000 house because it was kind of special and the bricks had to be brought from out of state. But he gave $10,000 to Colorado College as a subscription. He was also interested obviously in irrigation and water, and able to supply pure water to the population here in Colorado Springs. And he worked on that for a better part of his life. Also, education, books, libraries, access to those, along with other people that were here quite early on, like the Kingsleys. McAllister was very interested in getting schools and libraries started, and he helped very much in that effort, along with Mrs. Jackson, Mrs. Palmer, and a few others, including William Bell. So that looks like a pretty powerful committee there for the county library. Other types of concern, we've touched on this already. He helped start the El Paso County Industrial Association, and he is a director of it initially. What that is kind of like a county fair. It's an organization that would put on a fair in 1874 is the first one, and they were promoting all different sorts of industry. They had different classifications. Class E, as you can see, is farm, orchard, garden, and dairy products. And McAllister offered a $20 premium for the best milk cow. And that's how it was spelled, not a misspelling. So what we're talking about here, folks, from the standpoint of McAllister and his role, is that he's looking at how he would develop the economy here and how he would diversify it. This is what makes his position as executive director of the colony very different from the people that were in governance of the other colonies. particularly Greeley, that was so agriculturally based, would have very different governance, and somebody that's running it would have very different perspective on the economy. Colorado Springs Fountain Colony is developed on commerce and distribution, and so it needs a certain type of experience in order to develop it properly, and that's what McAllister is attempting to do with things like the Industrial Association. McAllister also had the ability, he was outgoing, people liked him, he spoke very well, and so he took advantage of that, and he represented Colorado Springs in a number of different national matters. He was the 1876 Republican National Convention representative from Colorado. That was very important. He was honored to receive that nomination. McAllister and the family traveled back to Philadelphia occasionally, and whenever he did that, he would do a lot of business. He would promote the colony, and he would stop in different towns on the way back east and talk about the colony, and he would bring fruit and produce to show people. He's hoping to induce investments of large sums of money in the mines of Colorado, but also agriculture. So again, that last quote that I just read and kind of stumbled over, what that's talking about is this diversification. And that's what McAllister is primarily concerned with, is a diversification of the economy. That's how he sees that he's going to have ultimate success. Then we get into some social issues, and this is where McAllister's Quaker background maybe is surfacing a little bit, but he's very interested in women's rights and universal suffrage. So in 1877, when there is a meeting of the Colorado Women's Suffrage Association in Denver, he goes up there and spends a lot of time with them, and he's elected to the executive committee. His wife, Elizabeth Cooper McAllister, was apparently somewhat shy woman. She chose not to be the face of the family when it came to universal suffrage issues. So apparently she was satisfied that her husband, Major McAllister, would be the family representative in this issue in particular. And then we've got a local scenario where McAllister is talking with Margaret Campbell at the Women's Suffrage Club of Colorado Springs on July 4th. He was very active in this issue. He was outspoken and very proud that when finally in '93, when the issue was passed, he felt like that Colorado Springs and he himself had participated significantly in the universal suffrage issue. So now we're going to shift gears a little bit. You've heard me say economy quite a bit. And so what I've been trying to show you is how McAllister personally influenced the economy here. And then we've started to morph into culture and social issues. Now I'd like to take a full jump into that and show you how I feel that McAllister and the McAllister family influenced the culture here a little bit. And I'm going to particularly focus on the house and the grounds, and get back to our interpretation here at the McAllister house. This is one of my favorite pictures. Take a look at this image, folks. This is circa 1875. It's taken from the third-story high school building, which burned down shortly after these images were taken, but it tells us a lot about the growth. So there's North Cascade. Most of the pictures that you see, folks, are city planted trees. There are a few in some of these backyards, but as we look at the Paber cottage here in the foreground and its gardening and horticulture, we don't see a whole lot. Now it could be off season, so we don't want to be too critical, but we don't see a whole lot of horticulture, which by the way is personal agriculture and botany, folks. So it refers to an individual's owned land and what they choose to grow on that land. Now, if we look back this image a little bit and look at some of these vernacular structures like we've got in the middle ground here, there is the McAllister house right here. And when I blow up this picture, I can see a few things very difficult to see, but I can see a white picket fence here, which is our boundary line, and I can see vegetation on the grounds there. The McAllisters looked to their Quaker and British heritage for ideas about architecture and horticulture, and they were going to bring those ideas here to Colorado Springs and contribute to the culture. So there are their grounds, about the same time period as that image, possibly a year before. I believe that this is the growing season circa 1874, this image on the left. So we know that that hedgerow that is in front of the front doors of the McAllister's house, that would be transplanted. Those were not grown, so those were probably plucked off of the river beds and brought up also. And this is a town tree, so this would have been a town planted tree. Now what we see over here by the McAllisters are some of the apple trees that they have already planted, and we see Mr. and Mrs. McAllister in fine Quaker form, not standing in the foreground of the picture, showing off the faces of their two children that they've got so far. They have put themselves in the background. What they are attempting to show their relatives that they would pass this picture along to is that what they have achieved of importance is that they have built this house and that they have gardened and got gardening going on their property. It is very Quaker, it's Quaker modesty, but it's also an emphasis on the home and the family and on their relationship with God through the earth, not so much on what they looked like. And so this is a very significant commentary on Quaker culture as we look at this picture. And then of course on the right, this is where they're buying their plot on the very northern edge of town at that point, not on the edge of town, but the furthest out of anybody living. And so there was nobody north of them for a few years. And this is where they decided to start their family and have their home. As you can see in the title, this is designed to be a rural English farmhouse, folks, and they bought a very large lot so that they could start their experimental gardening. Now, where do I get that moniker of an English farmhouse? This house was designed by a gentleman named Andrew Jackson Downing, and these are some quotes from the book where the design is found. It's The Architecture of Country Homes, and this is called number 17, a farmhouse in the English rural style. And that is the design of what we know of as the McAllister house. And it may have been built in other places around the country. This book is published in 1850, folks, by Andrew Jackson Downing. And what he's doing is he's giving people that newlyweds or people that are designing their first home, middle-class individuals, he's giving them ideas about different types of homes that they could build. So Mr. and Mrs. McAllister settled on this particular form, and they had George Summers build that for them. So it's very interesting to see that coming from a pattern book a generation earlier, the McAllisters chose a style. Now, what that style is supposed to represent is a farmhouse, as I mentioned, but a farmhouse with a thatched roof. So it's a stylized version of a thatched roof farmhouse that you would find in central or southern England. So it doesn't get much more British than that. And that is the style that the McAllisters decided on. We can see some of the reasons why they might have decided that. These are Andrew Jackson Downing quotes. To such of our readers that are looking for an expression of more beauty in a farmhouse, we present this design. I love the plan not for elegance, but for utility. That's probably what the McAllisters thought when they chose that, is that this is a utilitarian form that has a little bit of beauty to it. And for those of you that have been through the house, some of you many times, I think we would all agree that we find that when we go through the house also, that it's a mix of utility and some beauty. So I mentioned a couple times that one of the big contributions of the McAllisters to the town of Colorado Springs is that they established an experimental garden of their own on the property here on North Cascade. They had the intent of diversifying the economy. They were going to do the dirty work, right? The hard work of growing apple trees and having an apple orchard. I can tell you how difficult that is. We've put some trees in. They take a lot of nurturing. And what they wanted to do was to see what would grow best on the high plains here in Colorado Springs with irrigation, so that then they could report that to other people that were coming to Colorado, and particularly to Southern Colorado. The information you see here on the left is the recommendation by Major McAllister in Paber's 1883 book, Fruit Culture of Colorado. He's presenting this information at a meeting or a paper that he's delivering to a horticultural society meeting. And he has concluded that these are the types of apple trees that will grow best. And he is recommending those to other people that are trying to grow apples in the area. The ones that I've got highlighted are the ones, the legacy varieties that we've planted on the front yard at the McAllister house, both in honor of the McAllisters and all their work of experimental gardening, but also as part of our interpretation to show you what they accomplished here on the grounds of the McAllister house. So when we talk about apple trees, we're not just picking some particular fruit, and nor is it just a type of fruit that will grow here in Colorado, and in particular Southern Colorado. The reason for talking about apples, folks, is that apples were the most popular by sales type of fruit in the time period that we're referring to. So in the 1870s and 1880s, worldwide, they were the most popular fruit. They are still the most popular fruit today. So that has continued through. He is attempting to suggest ways in which people can make money and earn a living here in Colorado. He's doing that by doing the dirty work of experimenting with these apple trees. By the way, he also had Concord grapevines on the property, a large garden where vegetables and strawberries would be. So he was recommending different types of strawberries, but the whole plot was basically covered with these apple trees and the apple orchard that was here. And we're seeing the results of that. Notice the date of publication, 1883. It takes about 10 years. We can ask some of our audience here how long it took them for their fruit tree to mature and to give a maximum amount of fruit. And you got good prices for fruit out here. And so this was not a bad way to earn a living, especially to people here that came and got going early on the apple trees. So by showing you and talking so much about the experimental garden and the apple trees, what I'm trying to convey is that some of the things that the McAllisters influenced in Colorado Springs and the Fountain Colony were not immediate impact sorts of things. There were things that would take place over a period of decades, and their influence remained in the 1800s through the 70s, the 80s, and into the 90s, when Harry McAllister picks up the banner of civic importance from his father, and as an attorney in Colorado, and a very popular one, begins to have an impact on our state, just like his father did here locally with Fountain Colony, with bringing this English and British culture here through horticulture and architecture of the McAllister house.